Welcome everyone to the third lecture of our course, The Colonial Economy, which covers the entire colonial period from 1519 to 1810. By way of introduction, I want to briefly discuss the political administration of New Spain, to give you an idea of how the colonial system operated. At the top of the political structure stood the Viceroy. The Viceroy, the first key term on the lecture, was the king's representative in the colony. 62 viceroys served in New Spain during the long colonial period. Almost all of them came from the high nobility and were born in Spain. The viceroy's power was characterized by a certain amount of independence from royal control, mainly because of distance and difficult communications with the mother country. Remember that it took several months to cross the ocean at this time. Thus high officials often made important rulings on their own that would later require royal approval. Yet when a royal order seemed contrary to the best interest of the local situation, a viceroy sometimes noted on the margins of documents, "Obedezco, pero no cumplo," meaning, "I obey, but do not carry out." This was a phrase that all colonial officials understood well. It reflected the fact that, because of time lag in communication, the king might not be informed of the latest circumstances on an issue in the colony. If that was the case, it was wisest to not carry out the order. The colonial administration was indeed inefficient and bogged down by endless detailed reports sent to Spain by officials, clergymen, and private subjects. Just as important as the viceroy was the audiencia, which was a court made up of several judges whose powers somewhat overlapped with the viceroy. The Crown indeed designed a system of checks and balances as a way to create rivalries between colonial officials so that no one group would gain too much power and all would remain loyal to the king. Officials were even encouraged to comment on and criticize the performance of others. The audiencia also sent representatives to the provinces to inspect the administration of the towns and villages, where a number of lower-level colonial officials resided. I'll return later in the lecture to a discussion of the colonial system in the countryside, when we discuss agriculture. Let us begin with Spain's economic policies. Beyond saving souls, the purpose of the colony was to make money for the mother country. Throughout the colonial period, the philosophy that organized the transatlantic relationship between Mexico and Spain was mercantilism. Mercantilism was designed to make the mother country stronger and more self-sufficient by maximizing the flow of resources to the mother country. In other words, mercantilism sought to produce the largest profit with the least amount of investment in the colony. One of the main ways to achieve this was to monopolize and tax all trade to and from Iberia and New Spain. Trade tariffs were high, and it was an extremely protectionist system, meaning New Spain was not free to trade with anyone except the mother country. Commerce was supervised by an imperial system through an agency in Seville, which was the official port for all traffic with the Indies. Here is an image of the bustling port of Seville, located in southern Spain. All goods and people going to and from colonial Mexico passed through this port. Tight controls were put on commerce so as to benefit merchants in Spain. Everything and everyone going to or coming from the colonies passed through officials who checked all papers with care. All products destined for the Spanish Indies were required to go on Spanish ships and with Spanish crews, and, to facilitate the collection of duties, cargoes were channeled through one official port in Veracruz. Because of pirates, after the 1560s, ships sailing to and from the New World went in annual convoys with armed escort vessels. One of the big events in New Spain was the arrival of the fleet in the spring, at which time merchants purchased their supplies for the coming months. Here you can see the Spanish trade routes in white and the Portuguese routes in blue. When the fleet arrived in Veracruz, tents bristled on the beach, as great numbers of buyers came to negotiate in the bustling trade fair that ensued. Traders in Spain sent to the colonies a wide variety of goods, expensive fabrics, hats, wines, vinegar, olive oil, paper, steel, iron implements, and other items. The masses rarely enjoyed such luxuries, however. Rather, most people had to rely on native products sold in the local markets. A similar, though smaller scene occurred on the Pacific coast at Acapulco. Once a year, a fleet from the Philippines arrived at Acapulco, laden with luxuries from the East, including silks, jade, ivory, perfumes, incense, and other goods. Under this system, the colony was to supply the mother country with raw materials, which could be made into finished goods in the mother country and sold back to the colonists at a profit. Thus, the natural growth of industry and commerce was significantly impeded, because manufacturers and merchants in Spain were protected from competition of those in the colony. Furthermore, the Crown retained monopolies on the production of items such as mercury used in the mining process, salt, tobacco, and gunpowder. These monopolies allowed the Crown to maintain high prices for goods. The merchants in control of colonial trade were the main beneficiaries of this system. Merchants operated on a large scale. An elite group of prominent shippers controlled about 70% of colonial Mexico's overseas trade. Although they operated out of Mexico City, the merchants maintained kinship linkages to Spanish ports because most of them were born in Spain. Content with their control of the economy, merchants did not innovate because the dynamic scale of operations across two oceans called for systematic long-term ventures. Merchants concentrated upon importing Asian and European goods while exporting large quantities of indigo, cochineal, and other colonial products. Since there were no banks in colonial Mexico, merchants often possessed the only investment capital. They loaned it out to miners, sugar plantation owners, textile producers, and those who purchased urban real estate. Residing in impressive homes, their wealth equaled or exceeded that of wealthy landowners. Merchants enjoyed friendly relations with colonial officials because they financed the purchase of high as well as lower government positions. Selling government offices, it should be noted, was a way for the Crown to raise money. This gave merchants significant influence over colonial administrators, whom they pressured to avoid tax payments. Lax officials could also be bribed in order to smuggle in contraband. And the smuggling of contraband, by the way, was common throughout the entire colonial period, given the restrictions imposed on colonial trade. One of the most notorious ways the Crown exploited the indigenous of New Spain was through the repartimiento, Part 1b of the lecture outline. Last week we discussed the encomienda, which was a grant to a private colonist that gave an individual the rights to receive tribute and mobilize the labor of the Indians. It was a very oppressive system, so much so that the Crown abolished the encomienda in 1549. In its place, the monarchy decreed and established another system of forced labor, called the repartimiento. The repartimiento gave the colonial government the authority and rights to mobilize native labor. Under this system, each adult male Indian had to contribute about 45 days of labor a year to the colonial government, usually a week at a time at various intervals. Provisions stipulated that each worker was to be paid for their labor and treated with consideration. In practice, however, the natives were mistreated, forced to work excessive hours, and cheated of their pay. Labor drafts often took entire villages away from their fields at planting and harvest time. The repartimiento could also take the form of tribute, whereby villages were forced to grow a specific crop or produce a specific good that would be sold in the money handed over to colonial officials. To illustrate how the repartimiento worked in practice, let's have a look at the Real Desagüe, or royal drainage, a massive public works project that attempted to drain Lake Texcoco beginning in 1607. The Real Desagüe proposed a drainage system half canal, half tunnel, that would extend 8 miles north from Lake Zumpango, located at the northern end of Lake Texcoco. The plan was to give the basin an artificial outlet that pierced the valley's north ridge of mountains. Keep in mind that Lake Texcoco did not possess a natural outlet, so Mexico City often suffered from recurrent flooding, which became a growing problem as European buildings were constructed around the lake. The project speaks to the increasing importance of Mexico City in the Spanish Empire. It had to be protected from floods at all costs. Beginning in 1607, for over 11 months, urban technicians and 60,000 indigenous laborers bored through the northwest mountains of the basin to create the 8-mile drain. It was through the repartimiento that the colonial government was able to mobilize so many native laborers. Work was from sunup to sundown, and those that worked in the tunnel ate and went to the bathroom there. Each man worked with iron bars or spades and carried dirt from the shallow parts with sacks on their backs. The mortality rate is not clear, although thousands of natives died while laboring on the drainage project. The most notable feature of the drain was a tunnel 3 miles long, running as deep as 56 meters under the surface. It was one of the most ambitious early modern public works undertaken by Europeans anywhere. However, shortly after its construction, problems began to emerge, and the tunnel and drain needed constant modification. The wall's canals tended to cave, and the tunnel was easily clogged with silt and/or trash. Here is a map of Mexico City in the 1620s. You can see how the city was vulnerable to rising water. In 1629, disastrous floods struck the city. On September 21st, 1629, it didn't stop pouring down rain for 40 hours. Residents awoke to 1 to 2 meters of water in the streets that continued to rise. In short order, the only dry land was at the city center, a small patch near the cathedral that came to be called the Island of Dogs, as all the city's canines converged there for refuge. It was an unprecedented disaster that looked as if it might become permanent. The rains continued, not for a few months, but on and off for 5 full years, during which time the flooded city was nearly uninhabitable. A Dominican friar wrote that the city appeared a graveyard of wrecked ships with its damaged buildings poking chaotically from the placid water. Quote, "Her houses and churches, though of stone, looked more like ships than buildings resting on earth. They seemed to be floating upon the water, and as with waterlogged ships, which need to pump incessantly, in the houses and churches the pumping went on day and night." End quote. By the end of September, only 400 of the city's 20,000 Spanish families remained. Of the city's estimated 8,000 houses, 7,000 were a total loss, their foundations dissolved to clay. Many sought refuge in the neighboring cities, while others were forced into makeshift camps on higher grounds. Those who could not escape the city took up residence in the cathedral. Nearly every economic activity except canoe building ceased. The church did its best to function. Wealthy families that stuck it out were allowed to fashion altars and rooftops where circuit priests in canoes could administer Mass. The Viceroy ordered the image of Guadalupe to be carried to the cathedral in a floating procession of 200 canoes, accompanied by himself, the nobility, priests, and the pious to make petitions to the Virgin for relief. No matter what, people had to await the long process of the lake's evaporation as the monumental drainage ditch proved useless. Food was in short supply. Disease began to make its rounds in a trapped and weak population. At the end of the 5 years, 2/3 of the city's buildings had been destroyed. The Archbishop estimated that 30,000 Indians had died. When the waters receded, still the Spanish could not concede to relocate. The city was rebuilt. dikes were improved, and work continued on the drainage project. Yet the mouth of the new tunnel was still too small to accommodate the rush of floodwater in the rainy season, as water backed up in the reservoirs. After the great floods of 1629 and the early 1630s, colonial officials became convinced that the drain would have to be converted into a vast open trench if it were to offer any protection from flooding at all. The project stretched on for another 150 years, as flooding still occurred periodically. It grew in size and complexity, commanding considerable resources for construction, administration, finance, operations, and maintenance. In the end, the ancient lakes were not fully drained until the 20th century, but it had enormous consequences for the indigenous and Hispanic people living in the basin. The Real Desagüe made the Valley of Mexico more amenable to Spanish civilization and played a central role in the process of colonization. Today, only a few polluted remnants of the ancient lakes remain. Let's now move on to the colony's major economic activities and focus on mining in New Spain, for it was the spectacular silver strikes in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that provided the great wealth of colonial Mexico. Silver, in fact, became the lifeblood of the colonial economy. Precious metals such as silver and gold were such highly sought-after items during this period because it lubricated trade. Everyone agreed on the value of gold and silver, making it easy to use precious metals for purchase of commodities across the globe. Gold and silver were also portable. The 8-peso coins, minted in Mexico City and Lima, Peru, became the medium of exchange in ports from London and Amsterdam to Manila and Bombay. Some of the silver remained in the Americas, where it built cities and financed colonial administration. This, in turn, created all types of demands in the economy, and major colonial cities developed in response to precious metals, either at the mines themselves or along routes of supply. The Iberian colonial system, global commerce, and Europe's common industrialization all revolved around the abundance of America's mineral wealth. A fifth of all the silver produced in the Americas went directly to the king, while the rest went to private individuals. This was known as the quinto, or the royal fifth, which is the third key term on the outline. The second term. The quinto was the principal source of income for the crown. By the early 1530s, silver was being mined in several locations, but not until 1546 and 1548 did the great strikes in Zacatecas occur. Here's a photograph of present-day Zacatecas, which still has its colonial charm in the city center around the main cathedral you see here. Within a short time, people from central Mexico flocked to the mines, making Zacatecas the third largest city in New Spain by the early 1600s, surpassed only by the capital and Puebla. Because Zacatecas was not home to a large native population that could be forced to work in the mines, paid mining labor was recruited, primarily in indigenous areas to the south. Work in the mines was dangerous. Here is a photograph from inside one of the mines, which can be visited by tourists today. Workers labored far underground in the dark, damp shafts, breathing the noxious airs. Some were drowned by floods or killed in explosions. They hauled ore out of the mines by climbing up the notched logs that served as crude ladders, carrying their heavy loads in the same blankets with which they covered themselves at night. Poor diets, fatigue, and the unhealthful conditions in the mines made the workers susceptible to disease and early death. At its height, the mines of Zacatecas employed some 500,000 workers. By contrast, a few mine owners became very wealthy and lived in ostentation. Other entrepreneurs made their fortunes by supplying those who flocked to the mining camps. Equally prosperous were farmers who furnished the food that was much in demand in the barren north. At first, cattle and sheep were driven north in herds, but eventually ranchers saw the wisdom of establishing ranches in the vicinity of the mines, and this was the origins of the great livestock herds of northern Mexico. Until the 18th century, most of the colony's silver came from Zacatecas, but silver was also found at Guanajuato, San Luis Potosí, and Pachuca. By 1810, the year of independence, there were some 3,000 mines in New Spain, although some of them have been abandoned and most were small operations. The great wealth of these mines dramatically transformed the economy of the colony. Yet the vast majority of the colony's inhabitants worked in agriculture. Colonists were allowed to grow what they wished as long as their production did not conflict with interest in Spain. While most crops were produced for domestic consumption, landowners often focused on growing one plant for export to Spain. Cochineal, for instance, was one of the first crops to be exported on a mass scale. Cochineal was a valuable red dye at the time because it was essential to the booming textile industry in Europe. Here you can see the red dye on the nopal cactus. Cochineal was convenient for export because of its compact nature. It was extracted from tiny insects found in the nopal cactus, which was soon planted in extensive tracts. Another profitable dye was the blue extracted from the indigo plant. Cacao, from which chocolate was made, was another valuable export. Both vanilla and henequen were additional products of somewhat importance. Finally, sugar was introduced into Mexico by Hernán Cortés in 1524, and soon there were many plantations and sugar mills in the warmer climes of the colony. These export crops added to the diversity of the colonial economy. One of the main features of agriculture in New Spain was the great landed estates that, over time, came to dominate life in the countryside. These estates were known as haciendas. Here you can see the entrance to a hacienda. It appears to be a very large hacienda. Haciendas sought to control vast tracts of lands, either by acquiring the soils legally through royal grants and purchase, or illegally by fraud and or coercion of neighboring villages. Hacendados, as hacienda owners were called, did not necessarily seek to control all the natural resources in a given region to produce more goods on more acreage. Rather, large tracts served two related purposes. The first was to secure laborers by shutting them out of the possibility of setting up their own independent farms. Land was plentiful. In fact, there was too much of it. What was lacking was labor to work it. By hoarding some or all of the land, estate owners hoped the poor would have little choice but to work on the haciendas. The second reason for acquiring large tracts of land was to limit competition. The strategy was to acquire as much land as possible, far more than one could cultivate, and prevent neighbors from producing competing crops or competing for limited resources, such as firewood and water. As the native population declined by as much as 90% in the first century after the conquest, land was available for the taking. Yet large landowners had neither the capital nor the labor to work all their property, so most of it lay untouched. Again, the point of possessing so much land was to create a landless population that would seek work on the haciendas during the busy planting and harvest seasons, and to eliminate competition. Over time, as the indigenous population revived in the 17th and 18th centuries, conflicts between villages and haciendas for natural resources increased. These conflicts would later come to a climax in the 1910 Mexican Revolution. Ranching was another agricultural activity. The Spanish introduction of livestock such as cattle, horses, sheep, and pigs aided the colonization process and had far-reaching implications for indigenous peoples. In the abundant grasslands of North America, stretching from Mexico to Canada, livestock populations exploded with a seemingly endless supply of food. Cattle were among the most successful, and it was in fact the Spaniards who introduced the longhorn to the Americas. In northern Mexico, 30 to 40 cattle could stray away, and within 3 to 4 years, there would be 3 to 400 in the herd. Cattle became so abundant so quickly in New Spain that between 1532 and 1538, the price of meat in Mexico City dropped 75%. Cattle also provided hides and tallow, which was used to make candles. Indeed, just about everyone in colonial Mexico had access to plenty of candles. Travelers in the north reported seeing herds of as many as 150,000 head, and in the region of Zacatecas, over 2 million sheep grazed in summer pastures. Livestock trampled over Indian lands, which were not fenced in, and they transformed the landscape. Apart from eating everything in their path, cattle carried in their hooves the seeds of invasive plant species, which spread and altered ecosystems. Livestock overgrazed on the grasses to the point where much of it was destroyed, and the great populations of livestock declined afterwards. Yet the vast majority of colonial Mexicans did not reside on haciendas or ranches. Rather, most lived and worked in pueblos, or villages. Pueblos might grow crops for tribute or even for commercial scale, but most villages engaged in subsistence agriculture, growing crops for their own consumption, that is. Because the native population declined dramatically in the 16th century, between 1603 and 1605, the royal government resettled the scattered rural populace into small towns and villages in order to facilitate tribute collection and religious indoctrination of the natives. The settlements became officially known as the Repúblicas de Indios, but in daily conversation they were referred to simply as pueblos. Following the resettlement process, the pueblos assumed many of the characteristics that they still possess today. This map of a pueblo you see here was actually made in the 1920s. I ran across it in the archives and was struck by the continuity between the cartography of the colonial period and the 20th century. This map looks like it could have been made during the colonial period. Parish churches and state offices were symbolically built at the center of the settlement to represent the authority and social hierarchy. Orderly and gridded streets surrounded the central square, where the village's inhabitants lived in close proximity to each other. The Spanish crown bestowed lands to each Indian pueblo, which included urban plots for living space and surrounding cultivable fields, pastures, and woodlands. Pueblos also had their own local governments, or cabildos as they were called. Elected indigenous elites collected tribute on behalf of the pueblo. Village governments during the colonial period retained a relatively significant amount of autonomy to govern local affairs. They collected several types of tribute, oversaw fiscal administration, performed police and judicial functions, regulated markets and trade, maintained public and religious buildings, and administered the use of the pueblo's natural resources. While the Crown had designed the Repúblicas de Indios to physically separate the residences of Spaniards and natives, as the indigenous population recovered, the colonial government could do little to prevent the mixture of the races. By the 1700s, many villages in central Mexico consisted of multiracial populations. Yet throughout these changes, the inhabitants of the pueblos displayed a strong local identity and connection to the past through a fervent religious culture of village patron saints, fiestas, and pilgrimages. After providing tribute to the colonial treasury, village leaders redistributed agricultural surpluses into these lavish religious cults. Let's now transition to the third and final major component of the colonial economy: industry. Because the economy was so closely regulated to prevent competition with Spain, Mexico produced very little in the way of manufactured goods for export. Almost all luxury goods had to be imported from Spanish merchants. Expensive fabrics were imported by Spain from northern Europe, while production of fine cloth was forbidden in the colonies. Still, there were many products for everyday use coming out of small industries in Mexico. Manufacturing had an important effect upon the spread of cities and the economic development of various regions. In northern Mexico, for instance, furniture made at Jesuit missions evolved into what became known as the hardy, austere, colonial Mexican style. In the pueblos of central Mexico, porcelains, tiles, and blown glass were produced. The most common industry, however, was textiles. Cotton and woolen cloths were manufactured in textile mills called obrajes. You can see here, this is a painting of an obraje in colonial Mexico. Mexico City, Puebla, and Querétaro were particularly known for their high-quality cloth. In these cities, thousands of workers toiled in the obrajes to meet the growing demand for textiles. Conditions in the obrajes varied, but in general workers labored under poor conditions. In some cases, workers, as young as 10 years of age, were virtually imprisoned. The cities were also home to thousands of artisans, such as tailors, blacksmiths, cobblers, candle makers, goldsmiths, and so on. Artisans organized themselves into guilds according to craft. Well established by the 16th century, the guilds fixed both the quality of goods and the prices of work. People of the colored classes were allowed to join guilds, but only whites were allowed to attain the rank of master. In a more positive sense, the guilds were protective of their members, making provisions for those who suffered accidents and illness, as well as extending help to widows. They were also active in promoting religious celebrations and philanthropic undertakings in the community. To conclude, these economic activities, especially mining, made Mexico Spain's most prosperous colonial possession by the 18th century. Mexico alone produced about as much silver as the rest of the world. By 1810, New Spain contributed nearly 3/4 of the profits from all the Spanish-American colonies. This prosperity was reflected in ornate religious and public buildings that dotted the landscape. Yet mercantilism had grave consequences for the history of Mexico. First, it allowed outsiders to dominate the imperial system of taxation and trade. In other words, outsiders controlled the economic life of the colony. The second major consequence of mercantilism was that it excluded everyone else from direct participation in the Atlantic economy, since merchants controlled trade. These legacies of mercantilism would not be shaken off easily once independence from Spain came in the 19th century. Indeed, outside influence over Mexico's economy and the ability of a few wealthy individuals at the top to accumulate great amounts of wealth remain major issues in present-day Mexico.